enormous pleasure to introduce Isabella Weiss and an honor to be called her advisor. Bella received her BA from Reed College with a major in studio art and art history, and then studied art history at the University of Munich before entering the PhD program at Rutgers. Her dissertation, Vibrant Surfaces, Meadow Ecology, and the Prehistory of Landscape Painting in Late Gothic Media, circles back to her interest as an undergraduate in a career in botanical illustration and engages her sustained commitment to preserving ecological histories. It focuses on garden imagery and floral motifs in a range of art forms, including manuscript illumination, tapestries, ephemeral performances, and, as you will hear today, flower collecting practices. As she argues, the meadow as place and artistic representation can provide access to a space in which humans experienced and appreciated their entanglements with the Earth's surface and the biosphere. Bella's dissertation is situated within a larger narrative of how humans have attempted to define, cultivate, and master nature, and in so doing have caused the extinction of so many species. She also suggests that we can learn from the attention paid to individual plant species by artists in the past, and that the products of their creative engagement with meadowlands might prompt us to recognize and potentially delay the loss of biodiversity in our time. Her research has been funded by Rutgers University, the Delaware Valley Medieval Association, the Mellon Foundation, and the Huntington Library. Last year, she was the Sylvan C. Coleman Memorial Fund Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She is currently a junior fellow in garden and landscape studies at Dumbarton Oaks. Bella has developed and taught courses on themes related to this research and that engage students in critical art history, like one she taught on philosophies of art and ecology, and another called Art and Agency in the Global Mediterranean. Her talk today draws on a chapter of her dissertation and is entitled Between Meadows and Margins, Flemish Strewn-Flower Border and Wildflower Collection in Late Medieval France and the Southern Netherlands. Join me in welcoming Bella.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you to the organizers of this event. In the foreground of the famous Portinari altarpiece, painted by Hugo van der Goes in Bruges in the 1470s, various flowers are depicted in vessels and scattered across the ground. Previous studies of this painting have aimed to decode these botanical motifs as an assortment of religious symbols. This emphasis on uncovering hidden symbolic meanings has overshadowed consideration of how these blossoms evoke real displays of flowers in the 15th century South Netherlands. Hugging the surface of the picture plane, this floral arrangement would have appeared as if to rest on the horizontal surface of the altar on which this painting was originally displayed. By simulating the actual floral arrangements that were displayed in front of the altarpiece on church holidays, in vases and strewn across the altar cloth, these botanical motifs engage the sensorial sphere of smell and touch outside of the two-dimensional image. The scattered flowers in the Portinari altarpiece recall a new style of floral decoration that first appeared in the borders of luxury prayer books, known as Books of Hours, produced in Flanders in the 1470s. In this new style of border decoration, text and miniatures are framed by a rectangle of paint, decorated with flower motifs that appear as if real blossoms resting on the surface of the page. Like the flowers in Van der Goes' altarpiece, these flower borders are often decoded as sequences of individually meaningful religious symbols. However, exclusively symbolic interpretations of these borders ignore their uniquely physical and tactile appearance. In this presentation, I will argue that late 15th century Flemish Strewn-Flower borders cultivate, in the words of Bisera Pencheva, a tactile and sensorial aesthetic that would have induced in their original audience memories of the actual experience of viewing and physically engaging with flowers. In this pursuit, I build upon recent theoretical developments of the sensorial turn with the medieval and manuscript studies. In particular, I engage with Catherine Rudy's argument that manuscripts are inherently evocative of the haptic sense because their consumption constantly mandates physical touch. First, I will analyze the ways in which the unique formal qualities of strewn-flower borders encode bodily knowledge of picking wildflowers from biodiverse agricultural landscapes. I will then interrogate how the scattered aesthetic of strewn-flower borders recalls the appearance of real floral displays during various cultural events. This research derives from my larger dissertation project, which interrogates depictions of meadows and meadow flora in 15th century Franco-Flemish media in order to expose the pre-modern cultural and art historical significance of Northwestern Europe's now critically endangered biodiverse grasslands. Although the vast majority of the flower species in Flemish strewn-flower borders are native to Northern European grasslands, these borders are rarely discussed in relation to actual landscapes. While a number of the flowers in these borders did hold symbolic significance in late medieval devotional practice, many are wildflowers and agricultural weeds with no known devotional significance. I propose that these motifs are often not individually, but rather collectively meaningful. Arranged together on the margins of the page, they evoke the biodiverse grasslands that touched and surrounded the walled cities in which these manuscripts were produced. Some borders hint at the relationship between their floral motifs and collective landscapes by depicting flowers growing out of a patch of ground on the bottom of the page. The flowers in the borders of the two manuscripts displayed here seem as if to possess an autonomous desire to revert to their natural configuration as a collective field of plants growing out of the ground. Examples like this suggest that the scattered flower motifs in these borders are not abstract botanical decorations with implications limited to the spatial vacuum of the manuscript's binding, but rather are associated with the spatial and ecological setting of the meadow landscapes that extended outside of their pages. Traditionally managed Northern European agricultural grasslands pulse with the movement of insects. Butterflies, flies, and bees crisscross between blossoms. Dragonflies dart through the air above them, and grasshoppers, beetles, and snails meander their forest of fronds. The regular presence of all of these insects in strewn-flower borders strongly reinforces their association with these ecosystems. While on their own, the flowers could pass as a pattern of lifeless botanical ornamentation. When enlivened with the fluttering and buzzing of insects, these flower motifs collectively evoke a multi-species and multi-sensory habitat. The plant species commonly depicted in strewn-flower borders grow in a variety of different, though intersecting, types of agricultural grassland, including pastures, dry meadows, wet meadows, and arable land. The calendar sequences on the opening pages of books of hours depict this continuously intersecting patchwork quilt of fields, which blanketed the majority of the surface of the land in 15th century Northern Europe. Acknowledging these ecological nuances allows us to imaginatively retrace the steps of a walk that would have brought these species together in a basket, the pleat of a folded skirt, or the palm of a hand. On a walk through agricultural fields in Flanders in early June, I was astounded by the palette and diversity of flowers I was able to collect within just a half hour when moving through continuous landscapes with constantly changing habitat gradations. These are the same flower species that inhabit strewn-flower borders, and together they tell a story of the body's movement across the land. The illusionistic vibrancy of these borders diverges significantly from the floral ornament found in manuscripts made in the first half of the century. In a book of hours illuminated in Flanders around 1420, displayed here on the left, stylized flowers bud out of a vining web of penwork. This unified, textile-like ornamentation is markedly different from the Flemish border made around 1485, reproduced on the right, in which cast shadows and three-dimensional modeling promote the illusion that real flowers rest on the horizontal surface of the page. Rather than indulging in illusionism for illusionism's sake, I propose that these tauntingly palpable motifs strive to evoke the physical experience of holding flowers in the hand, and to entice viewers to imagine the possibility of reaching down and picking one up between their fingertips. These haptic implications would not have been lost on the late 15th century owners of these manuscripts, who would have had a very physical familiarity with the experience of moving through a meadow buzzing with insects, and with the sensation of squeezing a blossom from its stem. Written and visual evidence suggests that 15th century Franco-Flemish elites engaged in festivities that involved picking flowers while sitting on the ground in fields outside of city and garden walls. These practices are regularly depicted in illustrated calendars, in which figures dressed in court fashion pluck and exchange flowers in open grasslands. The creators of the examples displayed here have taken special care to highlight the physical act of picking flowers from the grass. Figures bend dramatically, bringing their faces within inches of the ground, as they make gestures of selective precision with their hands. In the example on the right, a peasant woman delicately plucks flowers and collects them in a basket, possibly in order to transport them into churches, castles, or city streets for use in floral displays. The figure in aristocratic dress on the left has pooled violets plucked from the grass on her skirt, one of which she holds up to her face as if to scrutinize it at close range. The details of physical engagement with plants in these illuminations suggest that they do not simply repeat iconographic tropes, but rather simulate memories of actual sensorial experience. Engaging with a manuscript with strewn-flower borders promotes a sense of intimacy with plants that recalls the visual and physical experience of picking flowers. The repetitive acts of holding down or turning the pages or leaves of a manuscript with fingertips is very similar to the act of pinching a flower between thumb and index finger. Because they occupy the space of the manuscript where fingers touch the page, flowers in Flemish borders are constantly perceived in relation to the human hand. The sometimes larger-than-life scale of these motifs evokes the close-range perspective onto a flower lifted to the eyes for detailed inspection. In different ways, the small size of many books of hours also recalls the haptic experience of picking flowers. Not only do these tiny books fit like flowers into the palm of the hand, the diminutive scale of their border motifs simulates the visual activity of bending down to look at and scrutinize, as if with a magnifying glass, the diversity of often very small flowers that compose it. Considering strewn-flower borders in relation to practices of flower collection expands the spatiality and temporality of what they represent. More than just paintings of flowers on a page, these motifs are implied references to the landscapes from which these flower species derive, and to the physical and visual experience of inhabiting and moving through these landscapes. I propose that the vibrancy of the flowers in these borders, still teeming with insects and showing no sign of wilt or decay, is a visual indication of temporal proximity to the act and locus of their collection. They are presented to us as the still living pieces of a landscape that have been collected and displayed in the interior space of the manuscript's page. Although the folios in late 15th century manuscripts are normally reproduced in an upright format, making the flowers in their borders appear as if pinned to or hovering in front of a vertical surface, It is important to note that manuscripts were read horizontally in the 15th century South Netherlands. Viewed in this format, it becomes more obvious that these borders are not arbitrary in their illusionism, but rather simulate the appearance of real flowers strewn across horizontal surfaces. There is considerable evidence, visual and written, for practices of scattering flowers over horizontal surfaces during church, civic, and court festivals in 15th century Northern Europe. The randomized arrangement of the flowers in strewn-flower borders, with blossoms shown from all angles, does not just evoke the appearance of such ephemeral plant displays, but also the performative act and haptic experience of creating these displays. They recall the sensation of scooping up a handful of flowers and throwing them over a two-dimensional surface, and compel viewers to imagine the visual spectacle of flowers in free fall from hand to page. I propose that these borders do not necessarily evoke just one of the various occasions for flower collection and display, but rather the complicated multisensorial act of collecting flowers and moving them inside human spaces. Whether brought inside a castle, a church, or the pages of a manuscript, the invisible connection between cut and scattered flowers and the landscapes from which they derive lies in the human hand. The physical act of finding and selecting flowers in rural grasslands and of transporting them to a desired location and of scooping them up and releasing them once again. The connection between flower and landscape, rooted in the human hand, is visualized in a book of hours illuminated by Simon Benning around 1500. On this folio, the painted surface of the margin has been transformed into the physical scaffolding from which human figures throw oversized pansies. In their free fall, the flowers create a pattern that represents at once the dynamic appearance of flowers in vertical descent and the static appearance of these flowers once settled on the ground. Below, figures catch these blossoms as they fall from the sky, while others pick flowers from the surface of the field on which they stand. Benning has painted a few of the flowers growing out of this meadow excessively large, in order to highlight for the viewer precisely what these figures are kneeling down to pluck with their fingers. In this way, the border creates a closed loop, from floral collection in meadows to celebratory scattering and recollection at a festive event. Hovering in between is the strewn-flower border itself, a form of decoration that simulates the act of scattering blossoms, at the same time as it compels its viewers to reach out and collect them again. The near disappearance of biodiverse grassland ecosystems in Europe today has obfuscated their relationship with the borders of Flemish manuscripts, which cannot be understood without considering practices of flower collection from rural landscapes. Filling the borders that surround text and image on the margins of the manuscript page, and the landscapes that surrounded the walls of cities in late medieval Flanders, species-rich grasslands were once intimately related to the activities of the human hand. It is even possible that cultural practices, such as flower collection, contributed to the biodiversity of these ecosystems, as deadheading flowers stimulates the continuous production of blossoms. Flemish flower borders are traces of a pre-modern cultural ecology in which the visual culture of manuscripts and the vibrant blossoms of meadows were mutually productive. Today, at a moment at which only 3% of northwestern Europe's biodiverse grasslands remain, retracing the link between meadows and the margins of late medieval manuscripts offers a lesson in learning to see, to recognize the plants and systems of more than human species that humanity coexists with, and to acknowledge the presence and belonging of the human hand within these systems. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, we'll need that. Okay. But what do I do with this? Do I just hold it? Do I just hold it, or what do I do with this thing? Okay, good. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm James Harper. I teach 17th century art at Penn State, where I'm also director of the Museum Studies program. But not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Cleo Rome. It would seem that from the moment that her parents named her after the muse of history, Cleo Rome was destined to study the history of Rome. Her paper today is the latest contribution to that history. Cleo is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History at Penn State. Prior to this, she graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Arkansas, and then went on to complete a master's degree in Italian Renaissance art at Syracuse University's program in Florence. She has served as intern and as a research assistant at the Galleria Borghese and at the Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Antica, both in Rome. And back in the United States, she's served on the staff of the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, as visual arts manager for the nonprofit organization Arts One, and as the Plant Humanities Fellow at Dumbarton Oaks, Harvard University's Research Center in Washington. Cleo's award-winning scholarly work focuses on the 17th century depiction of the natural world in objects such as paintings, botanical texts, and textiles, and also in spaces such as palaces, libraries, and gardens. Her essay titled On Being Planted and Portrayed, Horticulture and Floral Imagery in Seicento, Rome, will appear in Ghent University's forthcoming volume on the power of flowers. This research, as well as the paper that she'll present today, both gesture towards her dissertation project, which will reconstruct the garden at Palazzo Barberini from both an archival and cultural perspective. It's my pleasure to turn the podium over to Cleo Rome.
I'd like to thank Professor Harper as well as Aaliyah for organizing such an amazing and invigorating event, and as well as my peers and professors at Penn State University. In 1633, Giovanni Battista Ferrari, a professor of rhetoric turned horticulturalist for the Barberini family in Rome, published Flora, ovvero De Flora Cultorum, a book on flowers that blends manual, manifesto, and mythology. In his chapter on exotic plants, he describes Americana coralli arbor, claiming that its flowers rivaled coral in its beauty, offering one the hope of harvesting coral without the peril of stormy seas. Accompanying this text is an etching by Anna Maria Vaiani, showcasing a thorny tree with rhombic leaves, a detail of a trifoliate branch, and a banderole inscribed Arbuscula coralli, or Little Coral Tree. While Flora celebrates the Barberini gardens with lush prints and gardening advice, Vaiani's depiction of this tree lacks the blooms that Ferrari described. Its prominent placement as the first entry in the chapter of exotic plants suggests its significant value within the garden, to the garden's patron, Cardinal Francesco Barberini, and to a broader audience. This contrast between Ferrari's vibrant descriptions of the flower and the tree's barren image brings to the surface rhetorical motivations of the flower cultivation and desire both in and outside the garden. Today, I will examine the elusive coral tree flower in Seicento, Rome, first by contextualizing the plant within the transatlantic world of botany, then exploring its appearance in Cardinal Francesco Barberini's gardens, books, and private art collection. Through this approach, the persistent inclusion of the coral tree in cultural production in the Barberini sphere, even without its flowers, emerges as intentional and multivalent, each iteration supporting the family's strategic program to exert power over the built and natural world alike. The tree, like other exotic imports, signifies the divine support, transatlantic reach, wealth, and intellectual prowess of the cardinal, assisting his family's bid for both global and Roman prominence in the first few years after his uncle's crowning as Pope Urban VIII. Additionally, I will argue that the coral tree flowers, particularly those that would not bloom, captured the attention and the imagination of botanists and nobility across Europe, despite never actually achieving horticultural's main objective, to flower, and to fruit. This suggests the cardinal and his court's appreciation for the power of potential, hope for what was to come, and glory to those who could harness it. The coral tree is a woody plant native in the west and central southern areas of Mexico and Central America, as well as India. It can range from a smaller shrub to a full-grown tree reaching around 5 meters tall, with smooth bark and thorn-covered branches that can reach a diameter wider than its height. Its sword-like structure of brilliant red flowers acts as a guide for the long, thin beaks of hummingbirds that disperse its pollen. Meanwhile, its seed pods yield bright red beans in the springtime. In the 16th century, Bernardo Sahagún documented its flower called equimitza, along with its bean pods, and illustrated Mexica craftspeople using the soft zompantli, or coralline, wood for various structural and ritual purposes. This codex reached Spain by 1570, but language barriers and Spain's limited scope of the Nahua world diluted the descriptions of the zompantli, its wood, its flowers, and their meanings. In 1601, the most prominent botanist in Europe, Carolus Clusius, included the coral tree, or coralli arbor, in his book Rarorium Plantarum Historiae, which assimilated rare New World plants into the written tradition of European botany. This entry gives very little botanical or visual data on the plant. Clusius relays information about the plant as told to him in letters from an important Spanish merchant and amateur gardener turned royal pharmacist, Simón de Tovar, who was the first to have received the plant from his trading posts in New Spain. Tovar acclimatized and grew 2 trees from a pack of seeds from New Spain that were labeled coral due to its flowers' quote, likeness to coral. However, the trees died after a particularly bad Spanish winter, and the surviving tree would not bloom. Thus, Tovar could only send Clusius a small twig of a remaining tree. Clusius openly laments Tovar dying before he could send a better sample of the tree and its flowers. The story and a woodcut print of the trifoliate branch in Rarorium Plantarum became a convention after which many botanical authors modeled their entry on the coral tree for the next century, including John Gerard's Herbal and John Parkinson's Theatrum Botanicum. It is within the garden of Francesco Barberini and through the works of Giovanni Battista Ferrari and Anna Maria Viani that we see a departure from these conventions and a new rhetorical and figurative consideration of the tree. In the period between 1627 and 1633, when the coral tree appears in a variety of settings funded by or directly connected to the Cardinal Barberini, in the garden behind his palace on the Quirinal Hill, in the print and description in Ferrari's Flora, in a plant portrait documented in his Guardaroba, and in the Aztec herbal his colleague Federico Chesi was working on translating and publishing with fellow early scientists. From keeping with courtly fashions across Europe to looking at their inner anatomy through the first generation of microscopes and exploiting the rhetoric of flowers, Cardinal Francesco Barberini and those orbiting him were acting within continental-wide practices of plant-centered patronage, while also approaching the tree and its non-flowers with novel perspective, treatment, and depiction. On a diplomatic visit to Spain in 1626, the cardinal visited the royal garden of Philip IV at his main palace in Madrid. There, he likely acquired the chili red seeds of the coral tree. His private secretary, Cassiano dal Pozzo, a prolific collector of naturalia himself, kept a diary documenting their experiences. On June 23rd, they visited Diego Cortavia, the royal pharmacist and garden manager, who gifted the cardinal a small book of Indian plants and their uses, now known as the Codex Badianus or Barberini, as well as a number of, quote, curious Indian plants. While Dal Pozzo did not specify which seeds they received, it is plausible that they included the coral tree seeds, given Spain's position as Europe's hub for American plants at the time and the timeline of the tree's introduction to the Barberini garden. These seeds, possibly descendants of their earlier specimens mentioned by Clusius, would be significant to the cardinal and Cassiano, as they fit within the cultural and intellectual genealogy of the seminal botanists who'd they known from their personal libraries, Simón de Tovar and Clusius. Barberini and Del Pozzo returned to Rome rich with inspiration and souvenirs. By 1627, Barberini had hired Giovanni Battista Ferrari as a master gardener for his newly purchased palace, and documents show a 1631 payment to Anna Maria Viani for a now-lost painting of the coral tree, which included a grasshopper, a goldfinch, and 3 bees. The same year, she completed an etching of the coral tree for Flora. And here on the left is the copper plate that I found and identified in August. Likely inspired by his trip to Madrid, Barberini's display of exotic flora through paintings, including the coral tree, signaled his wide-ranging connections and cultural sophistication. This practice of referring to his diplomatic missions through art was common. For example, he displayed tapestries of the life of Constantine in his Palazzo's Grand Salone, tapestries which were gifted to him by King Louis XIII during his trip to France. The cardinal adeptly alluded to his travels for his guests at Palazzo Barberini, where conversations might revolve around the coral tree's journey, its mysterious flowers, and in which texts it had previously appeared. This setting would foster discussions about the cardinal's collection, a practice aligned with convention but enlivened by the Francesco's particularly rare specimens. Cardinal Francesco Barberini and his secretary Cassiano del Pozzo sought these exotic plants not only for social and political signposting, but also for scientific knowledge. Though it had a political function, the cardinal's interest in science was genuine. He belonged to the Accademia delle Scienze, a group of gentlemen scholars who pursued new perspectives on the natural world with an emphasis on looking. Their world was bolstered by new optical technology such as Galileo's microscope, which arrived with him in Rome in 1609, and his microscope, which came 2.5 decades later. The group's founder, Federico Cesi, invited Cassiano del Pozzo to join the Academy in 1622, and Francesco in 1627. Cesi recognized the pair's mission to Madrid, while diplomatic in aim, was also a chance to acquire exotic specimens, reflecting a deliberate and tactical pursuit of knowledge enabled by political power. Cesi and fellow Linceans noted discrepancies between ancient texts and new findings from the Americas, advocating for a modern approach to natural philosophy using modern technology. The occhiolino, or microscope, allowed the Lince to examine botanical specimens with unprecedented clarity, fueling significant interest in finding new means of classifying plants. Before the papal delegation left for Madrid, Cesi was already working on the Tesoro Mexicano, an encyclopedia based on Francisco Hernandez's Historia Natural Nueva España from the 16th century. His goal was to reform plant taxonomy, challenging classical methods that relied on visible traits. Months after the election of Urban VIII in 1623, Cesi wrote to Francesco, urging the cardinal to leverage his new political position to source specimens from Spanish and Jesuit networks in Mexico, highlighting the aesthetic and medicinal importance of exotic plants. 3 years later, during the cardinal's visit to Madrid, Cesi reiterated this request, including a wish list of Mexican plants. Cesi's quest for knowledge by using his patron as a broker of exchange exemplifies the interplay of science, culture, and diplomacy in early modern Europe. While we do not know if Cesi explicitly requested the coral tree, as this correspondence has been lost, given his familiarity with Clusius's writing and work on the Tesoro Mexicano, it is likely that he would have recognized the value of the specimen's provenance and rarity as it grew in the Barberini garden. By the time Ferrari penned Flora Ovvero de Florum Cultura and commissioned its engravings in 1631, the Barberini coral tree had reached 15 hands tall but had yet to bloom, despite Ferrari's efforts and hopes. Undeterred, he prominently featured the tree in his chapter on exotic plants of the Barberini garden, romanticizing its journey to Rome and establishing it with poetic descriptions of coral flowers. Ferrari's mission, like that of fellow plant enthusiast Cesi, was to contribute to an international conversation about plants while promoting their patron, Francesco. Unlike his contemporaries in the Accademia delle Scienze, which he was notably not invited to join, Ferrari infused floral discussions with imaginative narratives, transcending traditional botany to achieve horticultural vision steeped in both mythology and global relevancy. While Chesi sought to build on the work of Francisco Hernandez and Carolus Clusius for a more empirical and systematic understanding of natural history, Ferrari blended classical storytelling with contemporary plant culture, framing a larger narrative about the cardinal's cultural and natural patronage. In his introduction on exotic flowers, Ferrari extolled the uniqueness of the Barberini's garden global specimens, particularly those from America. While other authors of botanical texts focused on the plant's provenance and characteristics, Ferrari recasts their stories through myth. He presents an origin story accompanied by an illustration from Guerin, where Neptune, accompanied by 3 bees, a nod to the family's coat of arms, receives a golden vessel of rare flowers from a personified America and delivers it to the Barberini garden, thus weaving the garden into the canon of Roman mythology. Despite this allegorical approach, Ferrari's remarks on the garden's expansion reflect the cardinal's appreciation for exotic flowers. After acquiring the palace in 1625, Francesco began developing its gardens, which Ferrari extols for their abundance of singular varieties of tulips and daffodils. However, the most significant additions were the unique American plants, including the coral tree, which became the crown jewels of the garden's living collection. Ferrari offered vivid descriptions of the coral tree, of coral tree attributes while hinting at its elusive flowers, suggesting they rival coral itself. By insisting that their blooms were soon to come, he admits to not actually having seen the flowers yet himself. He deflects this misfortune by emphasizing themes of hope and transformation, inviting readers to indulge in their imaginations. In addition to earlier authors who compared the flowers to marine coral, Ferrari drew on the common themes of metamorphosis prevalent in Baroque Rome, creating a dynamic image in the reader's minds. The undulating and spreading branches of Viani's tree even resemble those of coral, pushing further this idea of the coral tree as transforming into being actually coral. Ferrari's choice to highlight the coralless tree reflects his focus on the flower's aesthetic and symbolic value rather than botanical specifics. This emphasis on imaginative narratives enhances the allure of flowers, contributing to the garden's prestige. As coral was perpetually popular material throughout Europe, Ferrari's promise that coral flowers would soon adorn the tree created an air of anticipation and curiosity. Ultimately, Ferrari masterfully created a narrative that intertwined beauty, optimism, and metamorphosis, leveraging the unknown nature of coral trees' flowers to elevate its status. His rhetorical prowess allowed him to shape perceptions of the flowers in the garden, echoing his horticultural skills in manipulating the plants to achieve stunning displays. Through his rhetoric and botany, Ferrari mobilized horticulture to highlight the Barberini's ability to defy traditional boundaries of European plant studies. In conclusion, the coral tree flower at the court of Cardinal Francesco Barberini, even in its absence, served as a rich symbol of the multifaceted strategies employed by the Barberini family to assert their influence in Rome and abroad. The tree's flowerless presence in the cardinal's garden, literature, and art collection highlights its intentional integration into the family's narrative of power and prestige. This exotic plant transcended mere horticultural interest within the broader transatlantic botanical exchange, and it became an emblem of divine ordination, social connection, and intellectual ambition. Notably, the tree's failure to bloom only intensified its allure, embodying the potential and aspirations of the cardinal and his court. This fascination with what could be rather than what is reflects a deeper appreciation for possibility and potential, a desire to cultivate not only gardens, but also reputations and legacies. Ultimately, the coral tree encapsulates the Barberini's strategic vision, intertwining nature, art, and politics into their quest for enduring significance in local and global contexts. Thank you.
Right, it's a great pleasure to introduce Silvia Giannolio. Silvia came to Princeton from the University of Turin, where she completed an MA in art history in 2018. Her master's thesis won the Biennial Award for the Best Master's Dissertation that focuses on the illustration and decoration of manuscripts and incunabula. This is from the International Society for the History of Illuminated Manuscripts. Sylvia contributes greatly to the graduate community in medieval studies throughout the area. She's presented her dissertation work at the Vagantes Graduate Conference, the IUDC Annual Doctoral Conference, and the Doctoral Workshop of the Art History Department at the University of Cologne. At Princeton, Sylvia currently organizes the Doctoral Workshop of Late Antique, Medieval, and Byzantine Studies, and she's a graduate fellow of the Center for Cultural Society and Religion. Sylvia has published on the cover of the Gospel of Sybil of Flanders in Predella in 2020, and on the manuscript inside in the Rivista di Storia della Miniatura in 2021. An essay that speaks to the more modern facet of her dissertation work is forthcoming. This is On Fragments, Restoration, Frauds, and Forgeries. Some observations on a creatively restored Romanesque cross and its counterfeit copy. This is a wonderful essay forthcoming in Fragments, Art and Meaning in the Middle Ages, edited by Pamela Patton and Catherine Fernandez. I'd like to close with a few words on Sylvia's dissertation, which I advised together with Charles Barber at Princeton. The title is Reno-Mosen Treasure Bindings, 1150 to 1200, and Their Histories, the Lives and Afterlives of a Type. Now, this is an admirably straightforward and communicative title that actually rather masks the complexity of the issues that Sylvia is tackling. The dissertation recuperates a corpus of objects that have skirted intensive art historical engagement, but present compelling themes that are really core to medieval artistic culture and its reception across multiple periods. The book covers Sylvia's studies are virtuosic blends of media and technique. Artists coordinated high-quality enamel work, ivory carving, and metal relief to craft intricate, theologically charged compositions for the exterior of manuscripts that were considered especially important in their communities. So one of the key aspects of the work that Sylvia is doing is a kind of shift of how we assign value to these works. The covers have never been studied as a group, and their connections to the manuscripts bound within them is a particularly rich and neglected avenue for research that Sylvia pursues, as you'll hear today. So is the topic of these covers' long histories of use and change as they move through ecclesiastical settings, then the art market, and other modern institutions. The study requires a nuanced blend of close material and technical analysis and historical theoretical approaches that contextualize the choices that were made in constructing the covers, in reworking them, and then describing and classifying them in modern times. And Sylvia is the one for this task. The eclecticism of this corpus, in which forms, styles, and physical parts with different origins are worked into a new whole, really very elegantly speaks to the spirit of juxtaposition here at the Barnes. So I am particularly thrilled that Sylvia will present her work to you here today.
And thank you, Beatrice, for the lovely introduction, and thank you to Alia and everyone else at the Barnes for making today possible and giving me the opportunity to present my research. Okay, so the title of my paper today is Reusing Sacred Text, the Lives and Afterlives of Medieval Liturgical Books. How can art history deal with heavily reworked composite objects? This paper explores this question by looking at a selection of medieval liturgical books from the regions now known as Belgium and the Rhineland. These lands have preserved an extraordinary number of medieval manuscripts intended for the celebration of the Christian cult, many of which are richly illuminated and display lavish external decoration in the form of a treasure binding, namely a cover made of precious materials such as ivory, metal, gems, or textiles. Close examination of the circa 25 books reveals a complex stratification of decorative campaigns, textual additions, and repairs, with the various textual units of a manuscript and the elements nailed to its cover dating from several centuries. On screen, you see a prominent example. These are the so-called Gospels of Notge, and while all its components were crafted in the area of Liège in eastern Belgium, they date from very different periods. So the manuscript dates from the late 9th century, the ivory carving was made around the year 1000, the enamels were added in the 1160s, the gilt plaquettes date to the 15th century, and finally the leather cover that coats the back and the spine of the volume dates to the period between 1585 and 1634. Objects like this have received little scholarly attention. Because of their composite, highly retouched nature, they resist some of the categories of conventional art history, which has for a long time been heavily concerned with autography and authenticity, with the aim of reconstructing patterns of stylistic evolution, workshop affiliations, and individual oeuvre. While searching for originally stylistically pure artworks as products of artistic genius or a period style, art historical research has often treated later modifications as obstacles that prevent the recovery of the original aspect of an artwork. This mindset has not been favorable to the study of composite objects, leading to the erasure of their complex histories and the neglect of the specific problems that they raise. In this paper, I seek to counter this interpretive paradigm. Although it does not fit with traditional art historical concerns, the heavily reworked nature of these books does not disqualify them as objects of scholarly inquiry. On the contrary, their composite character can be read as an index of value, specifically as a mark of their continued appreciation and prolonged use by the religious communities that safeguarded them for centuries in the Middle Ages and beyond. Using a gospel book from the Belgian Abbey of Affligem as a case study, which you see on the left side of the screen, I will demonstrate that as they became aesthetically and textually obsolete over the centuries, old liturgical manuscripts could be reactivated to perform a wealth of symbolic and practical functions for their communities. To this end, I will carefully describe and analyze the manuscript, attempting to identify, date, contextualize, and interpret the various layers of intervention it contains. Although at first glance it appears more homogeneous than the Gospels of Notge, this manuscript also reveals a stratification of interventions from different periods. But let's take a closer look at the manuscript. As you can see, this Gospel book features a lavish treasure binding on the front cover. At the center of the plate is a rectangular ivory carving representing the Transfiguration of Christ. Flanked by Moses and Elijah and surmounted by the blessing hand of God the Father, Christ reveals his divine nature and shines a light that dazzles the apostles Peter, James, and John, who are seen kneeling at his feet while covering their eyes. The scene is framed by a sculpted frieze of palmettes. The ivory is then protected by a set of gilt copper strips with embossed vegetal and geometric decoration. At the corners of the first frame are 4 small rectangular ivory carvings representing the symbols of the evangelists in anthropomorphic form. They are separated by 2 horizontal gilt copper strips showcasing repoussé palmette decoration. These elements are then framed by an additional set of gilt copper strips decorated through engraving. On the long sides, we see 6 elements of different heights and lengths, carrying a variety of floral patterns, and we will see this in greater detail in a couple of slides. As for the short sides, we see 2 inscriptions. At the top, we read Mundi Lucerne Lucis, which stands for Lamps of the Light of the World, whereas at the bottom we read Hic sunt Doctores Doctorum, which translates to Here are the teachers of the teachers. Fittingly, they allude to divine light and authoritative voice figures like the apostles, the prophets, and the evangelists represented in the ivory carvings. Finally, the outermost frame is made up of 4 metal strips in which 8 enamels with vegetal patterns alternate with plaques carrying cross-hatched and geometric decoration. All the elements of the cover were made in the area between Liège and Cologne in the 12th century. The central ivory is usually dated to the 1160s, although some scholars have proposed a date to 1100 or 1120, while the rest can be placed between 1150 and 1180. However, the cover as a whole is not a 12th century creation, for 2 reasons. On the one hand, it diverges significantly from the numerous treasure bindings made in the region around the time, which, as you can see, follow different compositional types. On the other hand, most of the metalwork elements bear signs of having been cut. The embossed and incised metal bands around the central ivory were cut and combined rather awkwardly, juxtaposing different decorative patterns without a rule. The inscriptions are truncated, and the horizontal elements on the outermost frame were also trimmed, depriving them of their granulated contour, and you can see that the almond-shaped decoration is also cut. The cover is most likely a pastiche of fragments from several objects. The strips with embossed and engraved decoration are a staple of 12th century metalwork from this region and are found on objects as diverse as portable altars, reliquaries, and treasure bindings. And at the top you see elements from the African book cover, whereas at the bottom you see comparisons with 2 portable altars and a treasure binding. And in the next slide as well, we have elements from African at the top, and a few comparenda from portable altars and a reliquary at the bottom. As for the ivories, while both the Transfiguration and the Evangelist symbols probably came from treasure bindings, the latter could also have been taken from a cross. Finally, the enamel strips are likely from a reliquary shrine, and once again you see African at the top and comparisons with 2 reliquary shrines at the bottom. This elaborate pastiche was probably created in the 15th or early 16th century, when the volume was rebound and given a blind-tooled calfskin cover. The leather is decorated with a grid-like motif and a series of punch marks featuring the monogram for Jesus or a griffin. Brass strips protect the edges of the plates, with the lower one also featuring 4 elaborate bosses. The same combination of chronologically diverse elements can be seen in the interior of the manuscript. The main text of the Gospel book, written in Proto-Gothic script, was produced in the scriptorium of Affligem in the first half of the 12th century. This is indicated by the content of the calendar, which repeatedly mentions St. Peter, the patron saint of the monastery, and by the paleographic analysis, according to which the manuscript can be attributed to a scribe called Fulcarius, active in the local scriptorium around the 1130s. The manuscript was unfinished, and as you can see, the areas reserved for decoration were left blank. As mentioned, the volume underwent substantial reworking in the late medieval period. Numerous decorated initials and rubrics in late Gothic script were added at the beginning and end of the various textual units, and the volume was foliated. The reason for these additions, made with the intention of facilitating the use of the volume, is revealed by a folio inserted at the beginning of the manuscript, written in the same script. It contains a list of the liturgical feasts during which the manuscript was to be used, with the passages to be read on each occasion listed with exact references to the folio numbers and columns. The accompanying rubric explains that on these occasions the manuscript was the centerpiece of an elaborate choreography. After being kissed by the prelate or his vicar, the book had to be carried reverently through the choir and offered to the members of the monastic community, who had to kneel and kiss its jewel binding. The Gospel book also received a generous, if somewhat rough-painted decoration, consisting not only of decorated initials like the one I have shown earlier, of which you have further examples in this slide, but also a series of portraits of the evangelists, depicted in their study, writing under the inspiration of their symbol. The 4 vignettes present curious iconographic details, which deviate from the usual norms for the representation of the subject, of which you have an example on screen. As you can see, the symbols, which sometimes carry a scroll, usually crouch meekly at the feet of the evangelists. On the contrary, in our manuscript, the angel stands in front of Matthew, holding a book from which he copies. The lion and the eagle also act as lecterns, physically supporting the books on which Mark and John are writing. Finally, the ox presents Luke with a crucifix. The illuminations faithfully reproduce the appearance of contemporary lecterns, often shaped to represent the symbols of the evangelists and crucifixes. Since both types of objects played an integral role in the celebration of the liturgy, their presence can be read as a reference to the context of use of the manuscript. Out of the 4 portraits, those of Matthew and John are surrounded by an elaborate frame on whose yellow ground are painted various species of flowers and some gems. The same motif fills the counter of most of the initials. These are features of the so-called Guerin style, which developed in the 1470s and lasted into the first half of the 16th century. The unusual details of the portraits, which push accepted iconographic conventions beyond their standards, and elements such as the style of Lux's chair, which is more Renaissance than Gothic, suggest a 16th century date for the illuminations and the related textual additions. The close chronology and well-thought-out nature of the interventions carried out inside the manuscript and on its cover suggest that they were part of the same campaign. The roughly contemporary ownership note on the added folio indicates that the manuscript was in affligem at the time of its reworking. This operation was probably carried out in the local scriptorium, which was still active at the time, as evidenced by the numerous mentions of scribes and painters in the documentary sources of the 16th century. The activity of the scriptorium peaked after, in 1520, the abbey joined the Bursvelde congregation, an association of Benedictine monasteries seeking to restore a strict observance of the Benedictine rule. These facts are not unrelated, since the statutes of the congregation recommended that the monks engage in the production of manuscripts, an activity considered to be of great spiritual benefit. The reworking of a manuscript is most likely related to these events. This hypothesis is supported, on the one hand, by the presence of 2 feasts in honor of St. Benedict in the added folio, reflecting the congregation's emphasis on incorporating several feasts dedicated to the founder of the Benedictine order in the liturgical calendar. And on the other hand, by the fact that a similar operation of restoration is found in a 12th century manuscript from the Rhenish Abbey of St. Ludgerus in Verden, also a member of the congregation. Like the Affligem Gospels, this manuscript was rebound and foliated around this time, also receiving a similar table of contents, which you see at the center. Indeed, given the congregation's concern for a return to the letter of the Benedictine rule and liturgical reform, the restoration and reactivation of all Gospel books would have been a fitting choice. Although obsolete in terms of script and even as a book type, since by the 13th century, Gospel books had mostly been replaced by missals, evangeliaries, and lectionaries in liturgical celebrations, this ancient book could still serve its community. Through a careful strategy of embellishment and functional enhancement, the manuscript was reintegrated into active liturgical use and imbued with new symbolic significance. With its seemingly antique jewel binding, the manuscript came to embody both the old Benedictine ways that the Bursvelde congregation was seeking to revive and the long and prestigious history of the abbey, the most prominent monastery in the Duchy of Brabant since its foundation in the 1080s. Indeed, by combining fragments of its old liturgical objects, the binding almost seems to offer a concentrated history of the community. At the same time, the contrast between these older elements and the fully contemporary style of the illuminations pointed to the community's commitment to preserving and maintaining the relics of its history. This Gospel book is not an isolated case. As mentioned at the outset, instances of reworking of all liturgical books are extremely numerous in these regions in the medieval and early modern periods. Manuscripts associated with the figures of saints, mythical founders, prominent historical figures, or more simply, with the founding period of a religious institution, took pride of place in these processes. Subjected to various operations of textual and decorative manipulation, these outdated books acquired multiple symbolic and practical functions over the centuries. In addition to being used for liturgical purposes and valued as embodiments of the history of their institutions, they often served as oath-books, containers for relics, and repositories for important historical and administrative documents. Their continued use in highly symbolic contexts justified their repeated reworking. In this context, the composite nature of these books is not a flaw, but rather an indicator of their enduring values to their communities. By examining these artifacts through the lens of their changing meanings and functions over time, rather than as static indicators of stylistic development, this paper reintroduces them into art historical discourse as vital carriers of communal memory and meaningful actors in the process of construction of institutional identity. Of course, given the highly reworked nature of these objects, a meticulous examination of all their components is essential to their correct interpretation. Just as the Transfiguration involves the removal of barriers to seeing Jesus as he truly was, the study of these complex objects also requires clarity of vision. Thank you.
Can I invite the speakers to join us on the stage? I brought a PowerPoint for my comments. I don't know if you have it loaded on the dock. Yes, there it is. Great, thank you so much for wonderful talks that have a lot in common, and I'd love to simply talk to each one of you about some of the themes that caught my eyes, and then some of the theoretical stakes of your work, especially how they interconnect. So I'll follow the lineup of the talk, starting first with Robyn. I was really fascinated by this Antler work of art, and so I went ahead and started looking at it and noticed that when you go online, it is identified as an ornamental shield. And I wanted to ask you about identification, especially in a museum context. Here, it seems that beyond the big stake issues with spatiotemporality, we have the problem of how to name objects. And here, it seems to be aligning with other ceremonial military arts. I wonder what you think about this identification and how you've come to terms with it, because you obviously decided not to use this kind of identification. So that was my first question for you. That then led me to really think about bone art in general. You mentioned some of there's one article, right, on this Antler, and a lot of the artwork here is compared across osseous skeletal objects that includes, say, elephant tusks, oliphants, other bone art, walrus tusks, narwhal tusks, woodworking. So I'm wondering who the artist might have been. Could he have been a woodworker of some sort? How is he applying his skills over to a protein exuvia of a cervid? And how does that then connect to other skeletal or osseous artworks? And here I'm thinking some of the other studies that have engaged with skeletal and osseous works of art. And then, of course, your big framework is spatiotemporality. And one fantastic study, of course, is space-time of the imperial. And you speak quite a bit about imperial domains of the hunt and force. And so when you think about deep time and these kinds of epistemologies, I wonder how your work might engage with the space-time scholarship. So those are my questions for you. And I think we can have you each answer the questions as we move along, maybe? So you each have an opportunity. Take this one.
Test. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for deeply engaging with this work. I really appreciate all of those questions. I'm really happy you brought up the issue of the shields. I couldn't get into everything, but yes, so when Fritz at the Rijksmuseum discovered this, and I mean, the work he's done on this is, he's done groundbreaking work on this and rediscovered this object. But a theory he's fond of is this idea that it is an ornamental shield. So this is like a chivalric object that might be carried in procession, or and you can kind of imagine it. So like, you know, here it is on a moose head, but if you held it like this and you gripped the lion base, you might see it as kind of a chivalric shield shape. But I talked to the royal armorer in the UK about this, and like in terms of chronology, like this kind of shield really wasn't in use in the period that this object was carved at all. Like this is a later form. And then Fritz and I got the object out, and we were kind of experimenting with it. It has these original, most likely original drill holes that imply the way that it hung in the tomb. So it hangs now in the gallery, and it also hung in the tomb, but we threaded the holes and we suspended it again to see like how it would hang, and it doesn't hang like this. It hangs like this. And so I think that what's really interesting is that in the tomb, it was suspended in the way that it would have been on the head of the moose. So it remembers the animal in the way it was displayed. And so I think that this issue of the shields, I don't think that that's what it was, but I do think that it says something really interesting about masculinity, because obviously the moose, this kind of like hyper masculine, like sexual pageantry related to hunting, and then like carried one step over into like this association with chivalry after the fact is extremely interesting. The next question was about, different osseous materials. So yes, these are, like especially the McGregor is so useful to me. I must admit that I am not familiar with this space-time of the imperial volume, so I'm extremely excited to delve into that. It seems like a really useful framework when I'm thinking about this temporality overlay that I'm thinking about with Antler. But who was the person who carved this? In the Middle Ages, people who were carving ivory and wood, they were like skilled in multimedia. They could work across media. With Antler, like the main other object type that is significant is combs. So earlier in the Middle Ages, there was this really important craft work coming from Scandinavia that was in comb making. And the reason that antler is better for comb making than bone is because of the grain of the antler. If you cut it in a particular way, it has to do with the way that you like orient the tines against when you slice it. It is less likely to break in your hair than bone. It has just like a different kind of collagen content and durability. And so each of these kinds of materials, tusks and wood and bone and then antler, which is similar to bone, but it's not exactly the same. They each have like they present the carver with a different challenge. But I think that medieval artists were up to the task, and they were able to experiment. And you do see in the moose antler the way that, on the front, smoothing the antler, we've lost some of that kind of what I'm calling primary antler, and you're getting into this porous, like bony interior that is just full of holes. And so I think that depending on the way that the nutrition that year, like a number of variables, like the antler would be different inside, and so you couldn't exactly predict like how deep you could go sanding. And since these moose antler, I don't think that they were encountering moose antler as a carving material very often, especially based on the corpus. They were really kind of feeling their way through this. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. So I believe we're moving on. Do you go by Isabella or Bella? I've heard both.
You can go with either. On paper, Isabella, in person, Bella is good.
Okay. As you wish, future Professor Weiss. We'll go with that. So I want to thank you for your paper too. I learned a lot about this material, thinking about margins as meadows. I had a couple questions for you, just born out of my own ignorance. The first one is, why do you think this kind of technique of illusionistic botanical painting occurs at this particular time and place? What do you think are the factors that led to this sea change in the margins of books? I simply don't know, so I'm curious to find out about that. The other question that I had is that you engage with the book as something that's performatively haptic. and you show these wonderful images of engaging with the flowers, either in the meadows or in the margins, mentioning Catherine Rudy's work, and it's something that's really inviting you to touch. But what struck me in all of the images that you showed, I didn't see any evidence of the flowers having been touched at all. And I'm curious to hear what you find, what you think about that. That there's an invitation to touch because of the illusionism and the so-called reality effect, to borrow Barth. But yet the pigment is pristine. As obviously, I'm interested in this topic based on what we were talking about yesterday. The other question I have is about thinking through the book as its own biosphere. And when I was looking into these manuscripts, you prompted, just like all of you, one of those Google searches. I saw other margins where the flowers are depicted as if they're pinned through the folio and they come out the other end. And so it looks like the folio itself is a material through which a make-believe flower of some sort has been pinned and therefore preserved. And so I'm interested in finding out your thoughts about the preservation of flowers in this illusionistic way, but also whether you found any flowers dried and preserved intrafolio in the manuscripts, and how you link this to actual preservation practices of flowers in the pre-modern era. And I ask about that because I recently attended a talk on preserving not just foods, but also flowers in the pre-modern period. And that included, of course, sugaring flowers to keep them in perpetuity. So I'm wondering what you think of when you look at these margins as a form of preservation, both real and allegorical within the covers of the codex.
Thank you so much for those really exciting questions. Okay, so starting with the first one, why this time and place, I'm really curious too about that question. And in the 15th century, we see a huge increase in interest in representing plants in a really hyper-detailed way, this really close attention to the details of the plants that covering the ground, plants detached from the ground. And it's usually described as sort of this inevitable increase in naturalism in the period that's happening in every element of representation. But I think that there's more to it than that, because there's such an extra emphasis on these plants. You see it in the borders of manuscripts. You see it in tapestry, which is another medium that I work in my dissertation, because in tapestry, all of a sudden you have these images from floor to ceiling of the detailed representation of plants that coincides with the emergence of these borders. So I think it has something to do with the interest of the patrons of these artworks within the French and Burgundian courts, and a particular cultural interest in flowers within that context. And I've been trying to dig out evidence for practices of engaging with plants within that cultural context, displays of plants during events within the court and within domestic spaces. But there's a connection between these artworks in different media and the patrons, and so that's something something that I still am trying to answer. So I that's sort of a hypothesis and more than an answer right now. But so why don't the flowers show evidence of having been touched? That's a really interesting question, because when I went on that walk, through the meadows in Belgium, I noticed that the flowers really quickly wilt in your hand because of the heat. So that's not an effective way to transport flowers. I've been hunting down and finding a bunch of representations of flower collection where they're picking them and putting them into baskets, like the one I showed. And a lot of times these baskets look pretty similar, so I think that they might be recording a type of basket that was used for transporting larger quantities of flowers for cultural uses and displays. So not keeping them in the hand helps preserve the blossoms. But still, I mean, there are borders that show a little memory of human tactile engagement, like borders where there are little strings that are tied around the stems and that connect them into a little flower crown around the border, and that little tie shows the trace of the hand on the flowers. Also the ones with the pinning, which are not pervasive, but they exist and are extremely interesting, which shows a different type of floral display, one that's not horizontal but is vertical, a pinning to a vertical surface. And I think those are really interesting in relation to evidence that I've been finding for practices of pinning flowers to tapestries. On royal entries, there are some records of flowers having been pinned to the textiles that were lining the streets, or potentially inside of castles on certain occasions. But I'm still looking for more and more of this evidence, but I do have some. So I think that that relation to a horizontal display is interesting because it makes the borders this space of recording different ways of displaying flowers at events, not just one way of displaying flowers this way, but other ways of displaying and preserving. But they're always so ephemeral, these displays, because if they're not in a vase of water, then they're going to shrivel within a couple of hours. So that also gives the borders such a celebratory effect, because they're showing flowers at this ephemeral moment, or related to a completely ephemeral display. And James Barrow claims in a footnote that he has seen evidence of dried flowers or dried flowers in the borders of books of hours from the 15th century. I haven't seen anything like that, but I mean, I probably haven't looked at enough manuscripts to try to find that evidence. But the question of relationship to pressing flowers in the pages of books, that's something that the Thomas and Virginia Kaufman discuss in a really interesting article on this topic. And they suggest that the flower borders in these manuscripts are related to practices of picking flowers at pilgrimage sites that were believed to be imbued with this holy presence, and so they were plucked and put inside the borders of manuscripts. I think that argument is really important because it brings the borders back in relation to landscapes. But one thing that I can't get past is that the flowers never look pressed in the borders of these manuscripts. They're totally alive, and so that makes them seem more related to display practices in which the flowers are preserved in different ways. But anyway, so thank you so much for those questions. I think that's enough for me to say.
Beautiful presentation. Thank you for that. That was linked to my question there for you, that sort of pinning to parchment, and the notion of eco-codicology. Lately, Holzinger has talked about the book arts as a byproduct of animals, and so your question is interesting too. The manuscript as a byproduct of flowers. Yeah, well, another way of thinking about it. So a different form of eco-codicology. That brings me to Cleo, right? Not Clio, Cleo. Cleo, great. I really enjoyed your paper on the cardinal's coral tree. And I had a couple questions here too, based out of ignorance of the material. Now, one of my first questions here, and it's something that you brought up, is that you showed that there were a chain of contributions in the depictions of this coral tree. And it seemed like the Clusius 1601 was kind of the prompter in a chain of contributions, including Viani, I think I misspelled that potentially, but yeah, Viani, 3 decades later. So you kind of see the source here, but then the departure. And so I'm wondering for you, where do you draw the line between the copy based on a visual exemplar and then live inspection? Do you think that this particular depiction in 1633 is based on both a previous depiction of the coral tree and an examination of the non-blossomed coral tree in situ, or does it represent an interesting and uncanny conjunction of both a visual prototype and an in situ observation? In other words, is it visual inspection of something that's already once removed from the biotic original? That was one question I had, because of course it has to do with the notion of copying, whether it's live or based on something that's already mediated. The other question I had for you is that it's called a coral tree. And so already in its name, it's pointing to marine life and the life of seashells and fossils. So even in its nomenclature, it's going away from plant life to marine life. And you talk about metamorphosis here. It's almost like a phytomorphosis in a way here. And so how does this connect, this coral tree, to other flowers and plants that are described in the treatise? And do others have names that point to the world of the sea? Or is this a unique example? So how common or uncommon is this naming practice? And the other is, how is it linked then to other forms of what you refer to, the naturalia, and collecting of seashells, of course, conchophilia, so the love of these kinds of marine life, collectibles at the time. In other words, how do we go from phytophilia, to borrow Marder's plant thinking book, from phytophilia, so the love of plants, to conchophilia, the love of seashells, and where does the coral tree fit in that landscape? So here, I want to thank you for offering us a new florilegium, sort of reading through flowers. And the last question is, it's a bright red, and besides the fact that red is a coralline color, do you think there's also a relationship to papal red as an allegory for the Barberini? Simply curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. So starting with the copying versus kind of in-person or almost like a portrait-like depiction, that's actually what kind of started this whole line of inquiry about this coral tree. When I was in my master's thesis, I was talking more about Anna Maria Viani and floriculture in general, and that was just another example of Viani depicting a tree and or depicting flowers, until I was looking at it enough and thinking, there are no flowers here. Let's look at the larger bibliography and historiography from the 16th and 17th century and see where flowers show up. And it's not until 1697 when Comelin actually gets this, young Comelin is able to achieve the coral tree. So it brought me to think, okay, what information are they using? And being able to track from author to author, I call it a century-long game of like botanical telephone, because it's Clusius recounting Simone de Tovar, and then John Gerard in the Herbal then recounts Clusius recounting Simone de Tovar, and then John Parkinson doing the same with the addition of De Florum Cultura, and you kind of see and that's in the text, and the images kind of follow this same route, and so you can see John Parkinson slowly following, kind of making the shift to copying Anna Maria Viani, because on a visual data standpoint, that is objectively more information than what Carolus Clusius is able to provide. And it's actually interesting, he gets the plant, produces the book, sends it back to Simone de Tovar's successor, and he's quite disappointed, because he says, this is not at all what the plant looks like. You don't even have an image of the flower, and that's kind of the whole point. I will commission someone to paint this flower, and I'll send it to you. And that's when kind of correspondence drops off. I'd love to find that, that painting in Toledo. But as far as Anna Maria Vianney, that was kind of my original question of why does she choose to depart from Clusius's convention that has been established, and thinking about how even the image of, or the composition of the coral tree is depicted as compared to other conventions of botanical texts. Usually it's like the tenant rule, like the number one rule is you want to show as much of the plant as possible. Its root system, its flowers, and even something maybe that might indicate scale. But in this case, it's almost posited to the audience like a portrait. Of like a bust, right? And so that's kind of got me down the road of thinking, well, she must have depicted this live in person, especially if a painting was commissioned for it, a print was commissioned for it after the painting, and every other depiction is this one singular trifoliate branch, then she must have done it in real life. Additionally, I think if there was any amount of imagination involved, she would have depicted the flowers. Imagination and information involved, she would have depicted the flowers so as to show this is how coralline they are. And so I think that's where you see, and then you still kind of see this nod to the trifoliate branch in the background. And so it's kind of giving a nod to Clusius and kind of this genealogy of the coral tree, but still presenting it as almost its own, not necessarily person, but object in its own right, as opposed to presenting a type, which is the point of a botanical text, right? It's like an overall general, specific enough to be identifiable, but general enough to be applied to most of these kind of varieties. And here, yes, I think this is when she kind of makes that intervention and says, I'm depicting, or shows that she's depicting a specific plant. As for plant life and marine life, Giovanni Battista Ferrari does not necessarily get much more into this half plant, half marine, or really explores much more of the marine in his text. He's really concerned with, it's laid out with garden tools, layouts of gardens, how to properly arrange and transport a bouquet, and then gets into exotic plants, which is really interesting. And he does a lot of cross sections of even bouquets and vases, so as to take almost a scientific approach to something that's so both of like a visual culture and material culture. He is, however, I think less interested in the play between, or the transformation between plant to marine life, which coral is increasingly interesting because it's an invertebrate that's soft in the water, and then you take it out and then it turns hard like a rock. And I think that's why the coral tree specifically captures that imagination, because that adds like one more step of it's like an animal, but then it's a rock, but it's also a plant that then again turns into this animal rock thing. But he's interested in this play of transformation and kind of telling this story. Even he depicts, or he writes about vases that have herbs and leaves and snakes amongst the mouth of the vase, so as to replicate one walking through the garden. So I think he's really interested in like the tactile and sensorial experience of these different aspects of floriculture when brought to life, as opposed to kind of checking the list off of what should be in a Wunderkammer. But yes, and then for the bright red, this is increasingly interesting as I get into this like etymological loop of, is it coral because coral is red called coral because it and so it becomes very much an issue, especially with Ferrari, of they rarely discuss the color red. They're just calling it coral. Even in the package of seeds that's sent to Simón de Tovar from New Spain to Toledo, it's the coral tree because of flowers that are like coral. And there's never any description or suggestion as to why. And the seeds are red, and so I think they kind of can continue on to that and say, like, okay, the flowers are maybe like coral in their redness, but that's when it becomes very ambiguous of, is it coralline because of the shape? Is it coralline because of it being red? Both. And that's when I think it's quite interesting that Anna Maria Vaiani kind of thwarts that and tries to depict both the tree and kind of this coralesque shape at the same time. I had not thought about the coral red connection with a cardinal, but I certainly think that's plausible, especially kind of at the very beginning of Francesco being elevated to cardinal as soon as his uncle becomes pope, and so that would be kind of another feather in one's cap in the garden. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So moving on to our last paper, Sylvia, thank you so much for a wonderful talk as well on treasure bindings. Of course, as someone who's interested in manuscripts, these bindings captured my eye, simply because we have a tendency to say this has been rebound and then leave it to the side. This is just ex post facto, so we'll just skip over that archaeological stratum. So thank you for having us stay on it and look at these bindings a little bit longer. I had a couple questions for you as well. The first one is that I'm struck by the bindings' aesthetic and material overlap with reliquaries, not only in the use of ivory, but also metal and enamel work. And I'm wondering what you make of that particular multimedia aesthetic and how it interrelates to what Holger Klein has referred to as the rhetoric of enshrinement. One of your interesting arguments is that these kinds of liturgical books were for a period of time quite defunct, in a sense, that they had become time relics and they're being revived, going through campaigns of restoration, filling in, and here several campaigns of what we might call, or what Clifford calls salvage collecting, which is also quite interesting to me to think about, because another question that sort of emerged for me is that we tend to think of scriptoria as functioning with, say, a leather maker, a pigment maker, parchment or paper makers, binders, etc. But here it's clear that there are materials that are navigating in the scriptorium that we might associate with other fields of production. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the rarity and preciousness of this material, and therefore they should not be cast aside, but rather be upcycled as a form of salvage collecting, and therefore how these bindings navigate a particular ecology of resources that can't be discarded, but rather, as you note, have to be part of a new amalgam that serves as a point of encounter for these objects of enshrinement. And then I really appreciate the fact that you've brought our attention to the fact that this is not just pastiche, even though you use the term. Pastiche has its negative connotations, but let's look at pastiche with its positive connotations as a place of encounter of things over time. And when I think about a book that goes through time, just like a person goes through time, you might be scarred, have wrinkles, but in the end you're a miscellany of encounters, which can add to some interesting features, right? So I'm wondering, for example, what you think of a palimpsest theory of objects and how time shapes those objects in your particular corpus. And here, of course, I'm thinking with Caldwell and Kubler. So thank you for bringing us to focus and judge a book by its cover.
It's on? Okay. Thank you so much for these wonderful questions that really actually hit the nail on the head. These are things I've been thinking about quite a bit in the process of getting my dissertation started. So the parallel with reliquaries is extremely strong, and it exists both in the high medieval period, like when many of these objects are first created, but it also has, it is also valid for then the late medieval period, where these operations of creative restoration often take place. And of course, as you mentioned, there is very much a parallel in the types of materials that are used, but you can also draw a direct comparison between relics as sacred matter and the scripture as sacred matter. So in the gospel book in particular is perceived as an embodiment of the absent body of Christ. It is Christ's representative in the liturgy, but also in the case of processions, in the case of legal proceedings, and it happened at times that during legal proceedings, a gospel book would be put on a throne. This is also why at times on the binding you see three-dimensional images of Christ that almost seem to sort of exit the book. So there is a very strong connection between the way a treasure binding is made and then the way sacred matter in the form of body relics is also treated. We can also add that books at times are carriers of relics themselves. So we have multiple mentions of this type of, especially it happens with gospel books, and you would have relics embedded in the cover, and then the gospel book takes the name of Textus Plenus, so like a full text that basically acquires extra powers by not only being the embodiment of Christ and an enshrinement of like the divine word, but also actually carrying relics. And these are type of books for a type of treasure binding for which we have a lot of attestations, especially from the 13th century onwards. Before then, it's mostly like documentary sources. So yeah, and there's another way in which we can expand this connection with relics and reliquaries, and is that operations like the ones that we've seen on this book also happen with reliquaries around this time. It's just that since a manuscript also contains text and an ownership note, and you can date the illuminations and the textual additions, you can sort of like connect them to a specific place. These operations, when they take place on a book, they are a lot easier to actually contextualize. But we have lots of like composite objects being made around this time, and so you have once again discarded enamels and pieces of metal that are mounted in the 15th century to create a cross. And you can totally see that the proportions of the object, the thickness, some parts of the added decoration are clearly not from the 12th century, but then 80% of the material comes from that time. So this is definitely an extremely fitting comparison. And as for scriptoria, this is certainly, once again, an example that allows us to think about a scriptorium as a place in which other types of materials may also be circulating. In this case, I'm inclined to think that at least the metal elements that you see on the covers could be scraps from objects that parts of which were molten down to be reused, sold for various reasons. We have quite a lot of like objects coming from the 12th century from this part of the Rhineland and Belgium, for which we basically only have the framing elements. So we have the wooden core, we have the framing elements, and we have huge sections in which probably repoussé, like decoration was used to depict like apostle saints, Christ, etc. And those don't exist anymore. And all you have are the enamels, which are, of course, not that profitable if you need to melt them down to get the metal. So, but at the same time, they seem to have had quite an abundance of materials, because if we look at the specific pieces of inscription that they selected, they kind of fit. They're very generic, but at the same time, they kind of fit with the characters that appear on the ivory carvings. As you see, the theme of divine light and the theme of like these authoritative wise figures. And in the 12th century milieu, the expression doctores doctorum is used a lot for the evangelists. So we have objects from that time that associated with that. So in a way, they had these scraps that they could somehow repurpose, and they seem to have had quite a lot of them, unless we have to think that it's just a very fortunate coincidence that they only had 2 little scraps of inscription that then fit perfectly with what they set out to create at this point. As for the last question, I do agree that the term pastiche needs to really be reevaluated, both in this context and, for example, also in like later contexts, like in the 19th century, for example. People tend to associate pastiche and forgery a lot, but pastiche can also be something that collector commissions out of like a bunch of, once again, little pieces and fragments they collected, and so they're just like, I have this book, let's make a cover for this book, and this is not meant to be any form of fraud. Like there's no intention to actually, sell the book for more than it's worth. It's just about have a nice object. I want to sort of, make it prettier. And as for the connection with Kubler, I definitely have to get more into the theoretical implications of the problems that I'm speaking of. For now, I've focused very much on this very forensic reading of all the pieces, because that takes a long time, and there are aspects on which I could not concentrate it, which are very much tied to the archaeology of the binding, and for which you need scientific analysis as well. You need to be in touch with conservators. You need to figure out if, I don't know, if certain parts of the book are broken. You can sort of try to figure out how many times the book block was stitched, how many sets of channels are there in the wooden plates, and so how many times a book was bound. And those are also elements that perhaps not that much in this case study where this information is not available, but hopefully it will be, because the piece is about to undergo conservation, so maybe we'll have more of that as well. So yeah, those are also areas in which that is very useful to consider, and that usually in the bibliography and treasure bindings rarely do appear. So art historians mostly look at what is on the cover, what is inside the book, but like the connecting element that is like the binding structure is really not often part of the conversation. And yes, this just to say that I will have to read more about the Kubler, but I do agree that like I'm really trying to focus on this stratification of objects, in which even like these small modifications, these small repairs that at times can be quite rough. Like in this case, we have a type of engagement with the object that is quite refined. You see that there's like a lot of planning and a lot of, there's some effort that went into this. We also have cases in which, in absence of like specific resources after a natural disaster, an invasion, a pillaging of the monastery, you have much more modest ways of engaging with these objects. But they're still very valuable because it's a moment in which the community barely exists. And so I guess that what you said about, the wrinkles and all of like, the signs of time actually also having value on these manuscripts is really, really something that I need to bring more light to. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we should probably open it up for discussion. So let me put it to the floor. Thank you all for your wonderful talks.
Thank you all. Well, we are just running a little bit behind schedule. So I think because our audience here can speak with our guests after, while we mingle, while we have a little break, I wanted to make sure I got to some questions that came in from our colleagues from Penn and Bryn Mawr Online. So I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but Larry Silver had a number of questions, but I'm going to just ask one of them, which was for Robyn, and related to this question around identification. So Robyn Silver says, he loved your talk and says, what's the basis for the brief note that this was probably a French 12th century carved antler? So if maybe you could speak to that dating and origin.
Hi, Larry. I hope you're still there. Thank you for the question. It's a really important one. So for dating, we do have radiocarbon dating for this object that posits that it's from the late 11th or early 12th century. So, but it's in a style that is to me, like, it's a very kind of universal Romanesque. Like, I feel like it would really belong in any court in Western Europe at this time. In the past, before this object was forgotten about, the Rijksmuseum said, oh, it's probably Scandinavian, but that was only because of the material, because moose now only live in Scandinavia, so it was assumed that because of that it was probably carved there. But looking at, we do have quite a bit of contemporary carving from, Norway and Sweden in this period, and there's no kind of slam dunk to say, yes, that's so close, that's what it must be. And so because it is in the tomb of Louis the Pious in Metz, and because there were moose in this area at the time, and because the style seems to be in a style that might as well be in northern France as elsewhere, I have chosen to agree with Fritz Scholton and say that I think it is fairly local in its carving. So thanks, Larry.
Thank you. And then for Bella, there were a couple of questions from Sylvia Hoftelling and Sophie Kerwin that related to questions around the fragility and really related to Professor Gruber's question around preservation, and really interested in the book as a form of preservation. And so they were just kind of wondering if you see the book and the margin as a space of preservation given the fragility and decay of the flower. And I guess I would push that even further and ask, like, both the material fragility as well as the symbolic fragility, right? That you have how does the flower function symbolically in terms of death and rebirth, you talked so beautifully about picking and then having that be the seeds for renewal. So if you could speak a little bit about that, the questions around the fragility of the flower and the space of the book.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that also relates to the issue of temporality and the seasons, because these flowers bloom. All of them bloom in early spring, or late spring to early summer. Some of them have longer blooming ranges, but that really is the season where you could potentially pick these flowers together. And, so what does that say when you put this spring, early summer border on every page of a book of hours that is meant to evoke the hours of every day and the cycle of the entire liturgical year? So it is this preservation of a particular seasonal moment and cultural practices of a particular time of year, and ephemeral displays of flowers that you could only see for a couple hours. So I think that says something interesting about the Book of Hours in general and how it was used and how people were thinking about it. One thing that I am interested in is how Books of Hours might have been used in conjunction with flower collection practices, and how the bringing of the book out into the fields while picking, and I have a little bit of evidence for that, could have kind of informed the experience of the books, and how that also gives, even though they are this year-round book, a particular seasonality to the importance of the book. But I'm still working through these theories. So, but thanks for the question. I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you. So we will break here.
So since we were a little over, we're gonna break and come back at 3:25. So that's just a little bit longer. So 10 minutes, and we'll be back for session 3. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.